According to the new IPCC report, there is a $3.6 trillion price tag to maybe sort of save the climate. Now, according to the latest calculations, and I'm gonna get to that later, how these calculations are actually made, the best we can hope for is a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. So that was supposed to be the hard limit. We were supposed to keep things below that. But in a couple of years, so they say, there's going to be this 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And the only question that remains is, how much worse does it get? So if we spend up to $3.6 trillion, and if we disrupt all kinds of industries and disrupt people's lives, if we do all that, then there's sort of a 50% chance it's not going to be horrendously bad, and it may stay within 1.5 to 2.0 Celsius degrees. So that's kind of the presentation that we're getting now, and of course, in the near future, it's going to be the major report of the IPCC and the latest calculations, and we're going to hear a lot more about that stuff. Now, usually, there is no actual risk assessment, whether or not we're wasting our time, we're wasting our money, right? Because that would be a horrendous thing, correct? If we actually spend that kind of money, we disrupt all these industries, and it has no real effect whatsoever. Okay, so that should be front and center in every report that you see, especially in these IPCC reports and the media reports. So the question is, how can we make sure we're not making a colossal mistake here? Now, it's not good enough to just mention these consensus studies. You hear that a lot. 97% of climate scientists totally agree with climate change in the IPCC. Now, these consensus studies are actually garbage, right? And what should have been done is a focused opinion research among selected active leading climate scientists, right? So you send out these surveys, and these scientists, they have to agree or somewhat agree or very much agree with a certain statement. How much do you trust these software apps that are being used to calculate the future climate? How much confidence do you have that in your specific area of climate science, how sure are you about the accuracy of what you're doing? How would you rate the accuracy? How do you think other parts of climate science, how do they fare? What their accuracy is? Do you think these different areas of climate science have been combined in an almost perfect fashion? And do you really trust that this has then been almost perfectly translated into computer code to form that one massive piece of software that rules the whole game? That opinion research should have been done, but instead these consensus studies were done in a different way. So people, not even experts for the most part, they accessed a database of various studies, papers, not even, this is not just a pure database of climate studies, and they just typed in the search terms, climate change or global climate change, and then they got thousands of search results. Next thing, they didn't look at the actual studies, they just looked at the short abstracts. Usually that's just a couple of lines of text that explains what the study is about. And just by looking at these abstracts, they started to determine whether or not this study is pro-IPCC, against the IPCC opinion on climate change, or neutral. And then they would basically count everything as an affirmation of the IPCC. That's how you got to that number of 97% of all scientists agree. So this is not really, first of all, this is not really true. And second of all, even if you had actual proper surveys done, proper opinion research among proper scientists, even if that had been done, their opinion is not the same as a real test of how good the final software is. It's one thing if a scientist says, well, I hope the software is really good and it can calculate the future 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how many degrees according to how much CO2 and all that. It's a whole different thing if you get somebody's opinion on it or if you can actually determine how accurate the software is. But how can you actually determine how good the software is? Well, you would have to wait. You would have to wait 50 or 100 years and then record all the temperature data and all that, and then check if the prediction was true or not. Unfortunately, that is the only scientific way of checking this software that's being used. There's no other way because we don't have a glass ball. We can't actually look into the future. We don't have a time machine and we can't travel into the future and travel back. You know, with measurements that we've taken in the future world, it's just not possible. You see, that's the difference between climate science or climate prediction science, because that's a specific field. There's a difference between that and any other science you could think of. So, for example, if you have engineering and somebody designs a car engine or something like that, you can build it sort of on paper. You can build it in a computer program, simulate it in a computer program, and then you can tinker with it, and at some point you can actually build the thing, a prototype, and then you can test it if it behaves the way it's supposed to behave. Now, it could take weeks or months or years until you get the prototype, and then you can actually measure the prototype and see if it behaves according to what you had in mind. So this is realistic. You can actually test it out in the real world. But with the climate predictions, you can travel into the future and then you can't travel back in time. It's just not possible. So, how good is that software really? Now, people always claim that climate science is international and that it is civilian, purely scientific, and that there's no corporate interest. That is the marketing. That's how it's marketed to be believable. So no country is interfering. No powerful country is interfering in it, supposedly. And no major corporations are interfering. And so it's very, very international. And of course, you know, no mentioning of the military, because that's would scare people. But then if you actually look into it, climate science is completely dominated by the United States of America and Great Britain. And this is not basically a recent thing. This is not some leftist thing, as people tend to believe on the conservative side. This is not something that suddenly happened and developed. This is not what the conspiracy buffs think. Some groups that suddenly appeared in the late 1800s or whatever, and some oligarchs and bankers, and they made this happen and they try to force this on everybody. No. Climate science and weather science comes out of the military, and it comes out of the most elite scientific circles, and they go back all through American history and all through British history, back even to the Royal Society, which was the most powerful scientific organization run by the British colonial empire. So they dominated science. And science changed the way empires are run. So for 10,000 years, empires were all the same. You had the farming peasants, your farming serfs, and they had to produce the grain, and that was money. And that's how you paid the soldiers. But when science suddenly appeared, the British Empire and then, of course, the Americans, they realized that there was a bigger game in town. You could actually create the illusion of freedom, and you can create the illusion of different competing ideologies, and people can vote for whatever party they want. And then you had sort of this controlled capitalism thing. And that whole transformation, that whole enlightenment, that was planned. So especially the old aristocratic elites, they never lost power. They had all the power. They changed the way empires are run. They went into the shadows. And so if you look really closely, most institutions dominating climate science and the most important people at the UK Met Office, the Climatic Research Unit, all these British institutions, these people were aristocratic folks. So they had some very, very important titles, and they came out of very important families. And so they wanted to understand the weather, they wanted to understand the climate, primarily for military reasons. And that's how they built this whole thing, for military purposes, mainly. In the United States, you had NASA and NOAA, and they, of course, have a security core. So when the moon landings were done and over with and deep space exploration seemed too expensive, NASA's focus changed and they started to focus on observing the Earth. Now, if you're observing woods and mountains and icebergs, you can also survey other countries and their military formations, their military installations. So that is how this thing was initially created. And so when the First World War happened and then the Second World War happened, weather data and weather prediction became more and more important. How many weather stations do you have? Can you disrupt the other nations' weather stations and weather planes? Can you sink their weather data ships? Can you steal the Nazis' weather data? That sort of thing. And then the Brits did the weather prediction for D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, and that was a resounding success. So it all depended on the weather. If you had too many waves, the whole thing would have been impossible. And after the war, some of these veterans and these experts, they got involved in the Climatic Research Unit and the Met Office. And at some point, you had the IPCC, which was dominated by Sir John Theodore Houghton, very well-connected guy. And so out of this military scientific complex, out of this grew the dominating science that was then fed to the IPCC. This is what matters. Not what the Germans are saying about the weather and the climate, not what the Japanese are saying, not what anybody else is saying. What matters is what the Brits and the Americans are saying. And so in the late 90s, that's when this whole climate scare became a whole nother issue. So suddenly, they claimed their models, their prediction software was good enough to link CO2 with global warming and to create this necessity to change all kinds of things about the way we live and the way we conduct industry. Now, the first pieces of software were hilariously bad. They considered the oceans to be shallow ponds. They considered vegetation to be like a green texture. If you remember some really old computer games from the 1990s, that's what it looked like. It's just a green texture. The software couldn't really understand plants and animals. And so then the software was developed further and fed with more data. And of course, NASA is supplying the data through the satellites. NOAA is supplying the data. These underwater buoys are supplying the data. And in every field of science, there are complaints, serious complaints by leading scientists, active scientists. So they're saying there's not enough buoys. We don't really understand the oceans that well. Why is this underfunded? What is this nonsense? Other scientists complain we still can't model clouds. We do not understand clouds. We cannot tell a piece of software how a cloud really works. And this goes on and on and on. Now, the satellite guys, they're saying we can pretty much measure things accurately with satellites, but we can't measure like millimeters of the ocean surface. So we can't really determine if oceans are rising faster or slower. And that's why you saw calculations of maybe it's going to rise a few centimeters, or the oceans are going to rise maybe 2 feet or 3 feet or 8 feet. We don't know. They really don't know. They can't really tell because with all this technology, there's still limitations to what they're doing. And so all this imperfect, humanly and technologically limited science, all that stuff is then combined in an imperfect way and then translated into computer code in an imperfect way. So the leading scientists are complaining we're not getting the best programmers, seriously flawed, and nobody even understands anymore how much off the target we are. Because you're drowning in data anyway. The ice core data and satellite data is too much data, and you can't really check all that data because your life isn't long enough to check all that data. And so that is the problem. If you try to measure errors and other problems, you're going to have 5 times more data, and it becomes impossible to work with. So for the average climate scientist, they're just doing their day's job, they're doing their day's work, and they hope for the best. But you actually would need perfection, or close, very, very close to perfection, to create that kind of a software that tells us what to do, that tells us what's going to happen in 50 years or in 100 years. You would need utter perfection. Now, if you remember back in school, or maybe you're doing math calculations in your job, if you mess up little bits and pieces in your calculation, the result will be off. Could be one little thing you miss or you get wrong and the whole result is wrong. Now imagine your calculation being incredibly long and 3-dimensional, and there's all kinds of connections going back and forth and feedback loops and all kinds of stuff. It is hilariously complicated. We're not gods yet, and artificial intelligence isn't really there yet. And so if you get little things wrong here and little things wrong there, or maybe even more wrong here and there, the whole result is useless. Now, of course, that also means if somebody was to manipulate things here and there, you could manipulate the result. That is entirely possible. And that would mean you just need a few powerful people in powerful places to manipulate the whole thing, the whole end result. So forget all these excuses, that have been made and these silly explanations. For example, there can't be a conspiracy because hundreds of thousands of climate scientists would have to be in on it and they would talk. That's not how this works. You can actually skewer the results if you just know where to do it. And as we've seen, climate science is controlled by the Americans and the Brits, and it's controlled by the military. Very old circles, very powerful groups. That is what we're dealing with. So manipulation is possible. We're supposed to buy the cat in the bag. We're supposed to believe in all these things, and we're supposed to risk and bet trillions of dollars on that. So if you read a newspaper and they're telling you, well, 97% of climate scientists agree, that's garbage. And if they're telling you that many climate models from all over the world, many pieces of software have said the same thing, that is garbage. So it's basically HadGem, the software run in the UK Met Office, which sort of belongs to the military and used to belong to the military officially. That's what matters. That piece of software is what matters. Now, if you told people that, oh, well, guess what? And there's a supercomputer in the British Ministry of Defense, British military, and they, the Americans, they bring all the data, and that one calculation is basically causing all this climate activism and all this, all these big changes in industry and in our lives. People wouldn't accept it. And that's why it is marketed as international, no interference from governments, supposedly, and no interference from corporations. And it's all very, very civilian and pure science. And there's no power. There are no power ploys behind it. So it's not a leftist thing, really, climate science. It's not really a leftist thing. And if you look at conservative critics of this whole climate change stuff, none of these conservatives will tell you the true story of climate science. They will not tell you the military background of climate science. They will not tell you how far back this thing goes and how, well, call it right-wing, the overlords are who run this thing. The aristocratic people and powerful generals and all that thing. They don't even tell you that. So that's why if you just follow online content and you don't actually read into proper books on this topic, you will never figure this thing out. I've written a whole book on this, and I have turned this also into a documentary, but it's all in German, so I have to translate this and then post it. So please support this channel. Just like the videos and share the links and subscribe to this channel. And the more you actually push this channel, the quicker we can actually get these projects